Hey folks, welcome back to Politics and History Chat on Tuesday afternoons at 4 o'clock when I talk about some of your questions behind modern day politics. So a couple of things. First of all, you got to know that my daughter has cleaned my shelves, as you can see, and as a result, the book tricks that I've been playing on you guys are not there this week because I thought you guys should all get a chance to appreciate just how perfectly she has arranged them. Other than that, let me go ahead and start today's material. If in fact you are not getting me, I'm not used to this system at all. Let me know, and I will try to catch it. Although it seems like people are here. So again, as usual, you guys had fabulous questions, and I'm really unhappy to say that I couldn't get to all of them, and I'm not going to answer the question about campaign finance, which I will do in another lecture, not a lecture, another one of these, simply because it's really, really good stuff. All right, so let me start here with a question that a lot of you are really interested in right now, and I can't imagine why. And that's the question of what is treason? And that's a really interesting question and a really good question in American history, or really in any country, because it's a fundamental question. What does it mean to betray a country? Literally, what does that mean? How do you define that? And a lot of us look at things that we don't like and think, that's treason. But actually making the rubber hit the road to say what is a crime against your country and what is not nearly so clear, because does it mean that you're speaking badly about the people in power? Maybe that's treason, but maybe it's just simply a healthy counterpoint to what's happening in among the leadership. Or does it mean providing water to undocumented immigrants coming across a desert? Or is that humanitarian? I mean, there's all kinds of ways that one might take stands that are against the people in power, but that are actually probably good for the country. So, for example, if you have an authoritarian leader, speaking out against that leader might be the best thing you could do for your country. So, in a democracy, there was a really central question of what does it mean to commit treason in a democracy, or in this particular democracy. And the founders really didn't want to tackle that. They didn't like the idea of trying to come up with a definition of what that meant when the laws really weren't written yet, and when it just wasn't clear what the government was going to look like. So in our Constitution, there is not a definition of treason, really. It says that treason against the United States shall consist only in levying war against them, or in adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. No person shall be convicted of treason unless on the testimony of two witnesses to the same overt act, or on confession in open court. Now listen to this part. The Congress shall have power to declare the punishment of treason, but no attainder of treason shall work corruption of blood or forfeiture except during the life of the person attainted. So the Congress can't write a law that wipes your entire family out of civic identity for eternity. And there might be a caveat to that in just a minute. All right, so the Constitution says that Congress is going to get to define what treason is. But Congress doesn't really want to take that on either. And it certainly doesn't take it on immediately when the early laws in the early republic, when they're first starting to figure out what the laws look like. And you have to remember that in the early days of the republic, they are really flying by the seat of their pants. I mean, George Washington is the first president, recognizes that anything he does is going to set precedent. But Congress also recognizes the same. And there aren't that many Congress people at this time. And they're all respectful of what they're doing. So they're trying not to create precedents that they think are ultimately going to be unhealthy for this new republic. So they don't really take this on. And early on, of course, the founders didn't foresee parties, political parties, and that's a different story that I won't really talk about today. I might have talked about it in the past, and I will in the future if you want to know. But very quickly, the American political system breaks down or develops into a two-party system. And those two parties are the ones who ally themselves around Washington, and they become known as the Federalists. And that is Washington and Hamilton and the people who want a strong federal government. Again, with caveats, I'm painting a really broad brush here. But a number of people who previously had loved Washington and who had even worked with Hamilton, who's a prickly character and hard to get friendly with, they started to worry that Washington and Hamilton were consolidating power too much, especially after Hamilton's early envisioning of a new federal financial system. And those people tended to be people like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who looked at the consolidating power in places like Philadelphia and New York and felt that the planters like themselves, the humble farmers as they would have considered themselves, despite the fact they enslaved dozens and dozens of people to actually do the farming, that they were being left out of this new system, and that it worried them terribly. So quickly they started to carp at Hamilton and at Washington to some degree too. And some of you may know that I loathe Thomas Jefferson, and I do so. There's a lot of reasons to loathe Thomas Jefferson. There's also a lot of reasons to respect Thomas Jefferson. He's a brilliant man, of course, in many ways, and he does all kinds of ducky things, like writes the Declaration of Independence and brings back a certain kind of architecture and all kinds of stuff. But the reason I don't like Jefferson is personal. And that's because he literally goes to Washington. And Washington doesn't really like being president at all. He really wants to go home and live with Martha. And and Jefferson goes to Washington, the man, not the city, and goes and says, there's this terrible thing going on. People are starting to form factions. There's starting to be these political parties, and this is a terrible thing. And goes on. He's the one starting the political parties. And I just can't stand that two-facedness. Both he and Salmon P. Chase, who's going to be Treasury Secretary under Lincoln, do that kind of crap all the time, and it really pisses me off. So actually, that's one of the reasons that's really why I don't like Jefferson, is because he's a creep. He says one thing and does another. Anyway, the reason I mention them is because with this split in political parties, each side, and this is the founders, believes that they're really the keepers of the flame, if you will. They're really the only ones who have the real handle on what it means to be in a democracy, or in their case, a republic. And I can explain a little bit about the difference between a democracy and a republic if you care. But what you really need to know is when people say, well, we're not a democracy, we're a republic, that's kind of like saying, I don't have a dog, I have a golden retriever. I mean, a democracy is a form of government in which the people have a say, and there's all kinds of different ways to organize that kind of democracy, that kind of government, a democracy. But when people say, oh, we're not a democracy, we're a republic, it's just one of those I'm being cutesy kind of things, and I know better than you. So for my purposes, you don't really need that here now. That's a philosophical argument we could take on another time. Anyway, so with this division, with the Federalists on the one hand and the Jeffersonians, or people who are going to be called Democratic Republicans, on the other side, each thinking that they really are the ones who understand democracy, they're starting to butt heads. And they're starting to think that the other side is trying to destroy democracy, that they're the ones who are the only ones who understand this. And the other side is evil, is trying to destroy this brand new country. So this is, causing a lot of trouble, and it really starts to take off and cause extreme amounts of trouble in America during the quasi-war with France, which is between it's between 1797 and 1798. And with that, the Jeffersonian Republicans tend to, the party, the Democratic Republicans, it's called, they side with France, and they really like the idea of opening up the idea of democracy to France, and they're really behind the French Revolution. And on the other side, the Federalists look at the fact that the French revolutionaries go far enough to, cut people's heads off, and they're like, we want no part of that in America. And as these two sides fight off with each other and believe that the other side is trying to destroy democracy or defend democracy, they start to believe that criticizing the government in power is really, really dangerous. So when the Federalists are in power, the Congress passes what are known as the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798. And the Alien and Sedition Acts are not about treason necessarily, but they do really limit what somebody can say in criticism of the government. So I'm trying to set up here the idea that even though early people are not talking about treason per se, they're starting to talk about whether or not you can criticize the government. So we have the Alien and Sedition Acts put through by the Federalists, and people tend to get all up in arms and go, oh, the Federalists were so terrible and they're putting down Jefferson. I promise you, Jefferson used them against his enemies too. Both sides thought the other side had to be shut up. But those are gonna go away. Those are gonna die a pretty ignominious death when early on in the 19th century people decide that being able to criticize the government is going to be a good thing in a democracy. But I'm going to take a little bit of a step aside here and say that I'm talking here about federal laws, but it's important to remember that states also have statutes about treason against the state. And that's actually going to be more important in the 19th century than treason against the federal government. And I find this part absolutely fascinating because, we talk about treason and treason being punishable by death. In fact, that's not at all the case. As I say, the founders did not really define treason, and they certainly did not define any kind of a punishment for it. So there was kind of this sense that treason probably was going to be punishable by something bad and probably death, because that's what it was punishable by in Britain. But Americans didn't have that. So as I say, the founding fathers had been really vague about what treason was going to be, and they had never determined a punishment for it, which was left up to Congress. And in the early years of the Republic, as people are trying to figure out what it means to be loyal and what's a state and what's a federal government and all that, in fact, there are a number of people who do get accused and sometimes even convicted of committing treason. And this is really interesting because they're convicted both against states, against the federal government and against states. So during the Whiskey Rebellion of the 1790s, 2 men were convicted of treason against the federal government. But President Washington looked at those men and decided they were not competent to have been, and they could not have been convicted fairly. So he pardoned both of them. So you got 2 guys convicted and then almost immediately pardoned. And then in 1838, Joseph Smith and 5 other Mormon leaders were charged with treason against Missouri. For their part in the fight between the Mormons and non-Mormons in the state of Missouri. And it looked bad for them, like it was going to go very badly, but they managed to escape before they came up for trial. So they had another one like that, where you've got this treason case. It looks like it's going to go somewhere, but they basically escape, so it doesn't happen. So now we've got this is 7 cases of treason that have gone away in a sense. And then we have Thomas Wilson Dorr, who's in Rhode Island, and he is convicted of treason against Rhode Island for his part in the Dorr Rebellion, which is of course named for him in the 1840s. And he was sentenced to hard labor for life, not to execution, but to hard labor for life. But he only serves a year, and then he too gets a pardon. All right, so we're up now to almost 1850, and we don't have a plan for treason. This is why I find this so fascinating. Then we have a very, very important case, and that is that in 1859, John Brown is accused of and convicted of treason against the state of Virginia. And John Brown, you will recall, is the person who launches the raid on Harper's Ferry, which was his attempt to start what he called a servile war. He was encouraging enslaved people to rise up against their enslavers. It went nowhere, and John Brown was almost certainly mentally ill. And I could tell you that whole story, but I'll save you for later. Save that for later because it might not interest anybody but me. But anyway, John Brown is convicted of treason against the state of Virginia. And John Brown is executed for committing treason against the state of Virginia. So when this happens, as one person said, law had been violated by actual murder and attempted treason, and that Gibbet was erected by law, and to uphold law was this military force assembled. So perish all such enemies of Virginia, all such enemies of the Union, all such foes of the human race. Okay, so why do you care about that? Because this is 1859, and Virginia has just set the precedent for the punishment for treason. It's death. Well, they think that's just a fabulous idea in 1859, but by 1861, Southerners are going to be taking a really different view of what the punishment for treason should be, because, of course, anybody who takes up arms against the United States government to support the Confederate States of America is, in fact, committing treason, especially if he has previously sworn an oath to uphold the U.S. government. So all of a sudden, this execution of John Brown, this seeming prophet from the North, is potentially going to take out the lives of hundreds of thousands of Southerners who have adhered to the Confederacy. And remember, in this very moment, that's precisely what's happening to people who are fighting for the Taiping in China. So the Confederates are really aware that this is going on. And this is one of the reasons that Lincoln keeps saying again and again and again, I'm going to be generous, I'm going to be nice, you can come back. And because he recognizes that they're very afraid that because they themselves have set the precedent for execution after treason, they're all going to end up being hanged. Of course, in the end, they are not. There's the executions after the Civil War are for the man Henry Wirz, who was in charge of the Andersonville prison camp, and the people who were involved in the assassination of Abraham Lincoln and the attacks on Secretary of State William Henry Seward. So there aren't wholesale executions, but this is something that Southerners are really concerned about for obvious reasons. However, during the war, there are new attempts to deal with the concept of treason because, it's happening right then. And so we very famously get a law called an Act to Suppress Insurrection, to punish treason and rebellion, to seize and confiscate the property of rebels. And I love this. And for other purposes, because, Congress is like, they're just throwing everything into a grab bag most of the time. So in the 19th century, there are tons of laws that are, A, B, C, D, E, and F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, And so that's what's going on with this name. But what's interesting about this is an 1862 act, and it is actually colloquially referred to as the Second Confiscation Act, because they really never deal with what it's going to mean for people's lives. They are really looking at the confiscation of property. And that's what happens with the Second Confiscation Act, although with the Second Confiscation Act, Lincoln is among the people who look at this act and they say, the Second Confiscation Act is going to take people's property for all time, and that's going to affect their children, and therefore it is unconstitutional. So the Second Confiscation Act was more an idea that didn't get used very much, that rather than ever actually accomplishing much. That being said, I got to throw this in here because I just think it's so interesting. There is, of course, confiscation of Southern property during the Civil War. And you know how they confiscated that property legally? Taxes. They imposed taxes on Southern properties, and when Confederates refused to pay those taxes, they confiscated those properties, especially plantations, for back taxes. So a lot of the property in the South during the war is confiscated on back taxes, and that's how they get it, not through the confiscation. That's how the Union government gets it, not through the Confiscation Acts. All right, so this seems like, I'm fascinated by this, but I've only gotten you up to 1862. So what about treason going forward? Lots of the ways we think about treason nowadays come from the post-World War II period, the Cold War. And most of you, when you think about treason, probably think of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. And again, I want to emphasize here that treason is really hard to prove, and it's really hard to define. So in 1948, we get a new law, a law that actually defines treason. And what that says is, whoever, owing allegiance to the United States, levies war against them or adheres to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort within the United States or elsewhere, is guilty of treason and shall suffer death, or shall be imprisoned not less than 5 years, and fined under this title, but not less than $10,000, and shall be incapable of holding any office under the United States. Well, this is in the midst of the Red Scare after World War II, and it makes sure that prisoners, that people accused, convicted of treason, are going to suffer death. But that being said, once again, really, really hard to prove. What does it mean? Literally, what does it mean to be a traitor to America? Most of the people who end up in prison, or in the case of the Rosenbergs in 1953, are executed or imprisoned for committing espionage, for spying, not for committing treason. Once again, it's really hard to figure out what treason is. And generally, people have thought that treason has to be committed by adhering to an enemy that has declared war on America. And this is really a problem since the War on Terror began, because what is it to declare, what is it when you don't have a declaration of war, when you have non-state actors? So on occasion, we've actually had American citizens who are working with Al-Qaeda, for example, or ISIS. Are they committing treason, or are they not, because they're allying with a non-state actor? So the definition of treason in America is still really, really hard to untangle. And I think we all have a gut sense of whether or not somebody is working for the country or not, and what that means to us. But there are very good reasons that our gut senses do not translate into law, because, you know, what I'm doing right here, somebody might say is traitorous to the current officials in power. And of course, I don't think that's the case. I think I'm actually honoring America by doing this. But I like the fact that it's very hard for somebody simply to say, as they can in North Korea, for example, you have spoken out against the leader, therefore you are a traitor, and therefore you must be imprisoned or executed. So that is the history of treason in America. And it's an interesting philosophical question. It's also got a really interesting history because of the idea of treason against states as well as the federal government. Oh, and I forgot to mention, in fact, there's a really interesting thing in the early laws of Arizona, which I got reading which are fascinating, by the way, and I got reading them for something stupid, and then I ended up not being able to tear myself away from them because they're so interesting. But in the early laws of Arizona, the treason against the state was punishable by death, quite explicitly. And that was a reflection of the fact that the people in Arizona had a real problem with Geronimo and the Apaches. And they were determined that anytime indigenous people rose up against the state government, they could simply be shot. And that was, so that's another angle in there of Western laws against treason. All right, so another question here. Natasha Bitter wanted to know how we could protect our free and fair elections from foreign interference, and I will talk more about that in the future. I didn't really feel like I had enough time today, and it's an interesting question. But then there's another piece she had here, and that is, can I explain why Obama wasn't more aggressive about Russian interference in 2016? Other people have been asking this. And I want to emphasize this again, because this seems to me to be a really important loose thread in two ways in modern American politics. And they're both really, really interesting. And I've written about both of them quite extensively last fall, and I'm sure I will be writing about them more in the future. And boy, are there going to be books about them. So the question is, why didn't Obama speak up when it was clear by the summer of 2016 in any number of ways that the Russians were interfering in the American election? Why didn't Obama do more? And it was clear in 2016 to the intelligence community, we now know, and we now know that both the FBI and the CIA had opened investigations of interference by the Russians in that era. But it was also clear for close political observers. So when you were watching the Republican National Convention and there was a change in the Ukraine platform, it was really startling. I mean, those of us who were watching it knew something big had gone on, because the Republicans did a 180. And there was a person who had been on that committee who said that this was actually at the request of Trump. So it's like, wait a minute here, what's going on with this? Like, why is this happening? Especially when anybody who's been following Trump's career knew that he'd been talking pretty openly, or his sons had been talking pretty openly about how much money they had taken from Russian investors. So, for anybody who was observing this in any meaningful fashion, there were some really big red flags. So why didn't Obama do more? And this is fascinating to me. All right. It's fascinating to me because Obama wanted to. Obama tried to get Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell to sign on to a joint statement rejecting this interference in the election. And McConnell wouldn't. He said he wasn't convinced that the intelligence was correct, and that any kind of a statement that Obama made, he would go to Fox News, the Fox News channel and talk radio and all that, and say that Obama was deliberately interfering in the election. Okay, so as a political process, this fascinates me, because why? Like, think like an operative, if you can, like a political operative. And I have a friend to thank for thinking this through. I have a good friend, and I don't know if I should mention his name or not, because I don't want to bring down everyone to his door. But if he gives me permission, I will share that name, because this guy is like the best on figuring out every angle of everything political. So when something weird happens at 2:00 in the morning and I think, what on earth just happened? I go straight to my friend and I say, tell me what's happening. And he says, well, do you remember in Toledo 2 weeks ago, there was a VW bug that flipped sideways? And I'm exaggerating, but not by much. He really knows all this stuff. Anyway, so he's the one who pointed this out to me, because he said, look at what's happening here. Like, if you are the Senate Majority Leader and you are running, your guy is running a campaign, and the president of the opposition party calls you in and says, crap, a foreign government is interfering, we got to make a joint statement about this. Would you say no? Or would you sign on to that letter and go out, say, I'm 100% on board with this, and then instantly go in front of the cameras and say, our president, our Democratic president, is so weak that Russia feels comfortable interfering in our election? It was a perfect political setup for Mitch McConnell and the Republicans, and they chose not to use it. Instead, they chose to say, we don't believe you, we're going to back off and let this happen. That, to me, is an unbelievably large red flag hanging over Mitch McConnell. And if somebody can explain that away, I'd love to hear it, because my friend is so right. That's exactly what you would have done. If you were clean, you'd have gone out in front of the cameras and said, because politics is a dirty game. Let's call it like it is. They're not all dirty players, but it's a dirty game, and you take whatever advantage you can. And there was an obvious, huge leg up right there that McConnell refused to take. There's also, by the way, the fact that he did not jump on the Merrick Garland nomination when it looked like Clinton was going to be president, because she was going to appoint somebody farther to the left. And the fact that he did not jump on that, even at the time, I was like, what's going on here? It seems to me he had a pretty clear sense that Trump was going to win. At least every sign is there, as my suspicious mind says. All right. But why, what is the next step? Okay, so why didn't Obama do something? Well, first of all, Obama tried to do something, but his hands were tied by McConnell. But the next step of it is another thing that I find really interesting. Why did James Comey issue that letter to Congress 12 days before the election that said they were reopening the investigation into Hillary Clinton's emails because of Anthony Weiner's, the letters they found, the emails they found on Anthony Weiner's laptop, which were there because he was married to one of Clinton's aides. So according to Comey and people in the FBI, James Comey and people in the FBI, they had not told anybody that the many members of the Trump campaign were under investigation, because you don't mess with a campaign in the latter days. Which is another one of the reasons where there's not going to be an impeachment right now of Barr or Trump. You just don't inject that kind of politics into our system this close to an election, or at least people haven't in the past. I haven't seen a reason to in the past. So why did he not give Clinton the same treatment that he gave Trump, especially considering now that political scientists pretty clearly believe that it was the Comey letter that was the nail in Clinton's coffin in the election. So why did he do that? And there's some really interesting breadcrumbs on this. And I don't have the answer, but there's two things going on. First of all, I think there is something that was happening with the New York Times and with Comey, and that is that there was such conventional wisdom that Clinton was going to win. They didn't want to look like they were in the tank for her, so they went too far the other direction. So the constant attacks from the New York Times on these stupid emails that 16 Ways from Sunday have been proven to be a non-story since. And I wrote about that, by the way, last October. The Senate report from the Republicans came out through Chuck Grassley's office, and it was a nothing burger. So why did they hammer it again and again and again? Because they didn't want to look like they were just dumping on Trump. They wanted to have something to dump on her about too. And that was a pretty easy, low-hanging fruit kind of thing, because she has always held her cards really close to her vest, and she did not have a lot of dirt to drag up. She basically had to be manufactured, and that was easy, so they kept hitting on that. So partly is that they were trying to retain their credibility for after the election when she became president, as they all thought was going to happen. But that's much less interesting in a way to me than Comey. And that is that Comey actually has talked about this on one occasion. And he gave testimony in Congress before the House Intelligence Committee about why he had issued that letter. And I'm going to read it to you, and it's going to be, he was saying it, and I'm obviously not going to say it exactly the same way he did, and it's not clear sentences because he was speaking. But he said, quote, "I was concerned that there appeared to be in the media a number of stories that might have been based on communications reporters or non-reporters like Rudy Giuliani were having with people in the New York field office," that is the FBI office. In particular, in, I want to say mid-October, maybe a little later, Mr. Giuliani was making statements that appeared to be based on his knowledge of workings inside the FBI New York. And then my recollection is there were other stories that were in the same ballpark that gave me a general concern that we may have a leak problem, unauthorized disclosure problem, out of New York. And so I asked that it be investigated. Okay, so he thought that people in the FBI office were leaking to Giuliani, that they had this laptop. And he was afraid that it was going to come out, not from him, but through these rogue FBI agents. And then he says, and then he didn't say anything. 2 days before Comey released that letter on October 26th, Rudy Giuliani was actually on a Fox News Channel program. And he told Martha MacCallum on that program, quote, "I do think that all of these revelations about Hillary Clinton are beginning to have an impact. Trump's got a surprise or two that you're going to hear about in the next 2 days." Well, it turns out now we know that people in that field office were probably leaking to Giuliani. They were also leaking it to Devin Nunes from California, who was on the House Intelligence Committee at the time. So I'm sorry, it's not clear who was leaking, whether they were leaking straight to Giuliani or to Nunes and then through him into Giuliani. But clearly what's going on here is that Comey was concerned that he was going to get scooped by his FBI office in New York City, who would say that this investigation is going on and the FBI is covering it up. And this, now that we know what we do about Giuliani and his desperate decision to find or his desperate attempts to find dirt on people and manufacture dirt on people, it looks like Comey let that go because he was trying to make sure Giuliani didn't come out with this this statement, and other FBI agents didn't come out with a statement that he was covering something up. He was trying to protect the FBI. He went on to say, I'm sorry, Attorney General Loretta Lynch also talked to the Justice Department's Inspector General. And she said she had a conversation with Comey not long after that letter in which she said, quote, and Comey said, and he said to me that it had become clear to him, he didn't say over the course of what investigation or whatever, he said, it's clear to me that there is a cadre of senior people in New York who have a deep and visceral hatred of Secretary Clinton. And he said it is deep. And he said it was surprising to him or stunning to him. But he was saying bias did exist, and it was hard to manage because these were agents that were very, very senior or had even timed out and were staying on, and therefore did not really feel under the same pressure from headquarters or anything to that effect. So for all that Trump keeps screaming about how there was prejudice against him in the FBI, it looks like it was the other way around. And interestingly enough, even though, as I read to you, Comey says he started an investigation of this, we've never heard any more about it. So I'm very curious about whether or not we'll ever hear about that investigation, what it will turn up, and whether or not it'll turn up that this was rigged. That being said, the Committee for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, CREW, has sued to see if there was an investigation, and if so, what it looked like. All right, so that's why Obama didn't do more, and of course he didn't do more at first in his administration, because he really believed that he could work with Republicans. And as I keep saying, you know, the people in power now have the label Republicans, but they are not traditional Republicans. They're ideologues. They're far extremist ideologues who embrace this movement conservative ideology. And as such, they are not able to compromise. So, you know, every time he tried to compromise, they would just pull the rug out from under him and move further to the right. So, and he didn't figure that out for longer than he ought to have. All right. So that's those questions. And now another question that you guys are thinking about, and that is, again, hypothetical. What would happen if Trump drops out of the presidential race for 2020? You know that I have said all along that he would probably resign before his term was out. And people have asked, why do I think that? You know, he doesn't seem like it. I only think that for the reason that it fits his personality. That's what toxic, or it's called malignant narcissists do. They create as much havoc as they possibly can until they create complete havoc and run everything into the ground, and then they declare victory and they walk away. And this is exactly what Nixon did. If you look at his resignation, the way he writes up his resignation in his memoirs, he never admits he did anything wrong. He simply says the liberal media, as he calls it, made it impossible for him to do his job. So it was better for the country because he'd been hounded out of his job for him to resign. Never admits he did anything wrong. And as he later told an interviewer, if the president does it, it means it's not wrong. So I've always just said, you know, if you look at Trump's everything he's done, he creates havoc, he bankrupts something, and then he walks away. And there's a great book by a reporter, a sports guy named Jeff Pearlman, about Trump's experiences in the whichever football league it was he was trying to start. And he did the exact same thing there and left everybody else holding the bag. And it just fits with everything that's sort of piling up on Trump. And with the increasing stories you're hearing coming out, that he would in fact resign. So what would that look like right now? A lot of people are asking about pardons. Well, yes, Pence could pardon him, or any other president could pardon him. And as I keep saying, a presidential pardon is a get out of jail free card. Now, we've got a little bit of an issue now in that you can't get a pardon for impeachment, but it's unclear in the Constitution whether that means that you can't be pardoned if you have been impeached, or if you are it is during the time of an impeachment. I incline to think it is the latter, that having been impeached and acquitted, that point is moot, but I'm sure people will argue that into the ground. That being said, I keep saying that a presidential pardon is a get out of jail free card, and it absolutely is for federal crimes and for crimes committed in office. Trump's got himself a big problem in that he appears to be on the hook for state crimes, and a presidential pardon does nothing for those. So that's the real question. Like, what would he do about the problems that he is facing in the Southern District of New York? And the reason the Southern District of New York is as important as it is because that's where Manhattan is, and that's where financial transactions happen. So if you have committed any kind of financial fraud or financial crimes, you are almost certainly going to find yourself at the wrong end of the examining table from the Southern District of New York. And you will remember, I think it's 2 weeks ago now, Attorney General William Barr tried to get rid of the U.S. attorney in position at the Southern District of New York, which was fascinating because the guy, Jeff Berman, his name was actually handpicked by Trump, and he was a Trump supporter, but he once in office, he actually pretty much did his job, and that obviously made the Attorney General and the President uncomfortable, and they tried to replace him not with his deputy, which is how it's supposed to be done, but with an outsider coming in from New Jersey. An outsider who, by the way, had worked with Deutsche Bank, who is Trump's banker. Other banks wouldn't touch him after his bankruptcies, and Deutsche Bank would. So that's why Jeff Berman refused to step down until Barr backed off and said, okay, we'll replace you with your deputy. And at that point, Berman felt that his investigations were safe enough that he felt comfortable stepping down. So that's how we got his replacement, his deputy stepping up into his place as the interim Attorney General. She hasn't been confirmed, interim Attorney General for the Southern District of New York, and whether or not her job stays secure is going to be really interesting. Okay, so that's why the Southern District of New York is really important. But as people are pointing out right now, if he increasingly is caught between a rock and a hard place. And if you are either he's got to be reelected, and there's a number of ways. I'm not saying he's not going to be reelected. There's an awful lot of ways that could happen, some nefarious and some not. But if, in fact, he either has to be reelected, which is why he has been so dead set on reelection. And if you think about it, if you want to step back for a second, Trump's obsession with being reelected is really unusual. Like, presidents almost always want to be reelected, but they're not like obsessed with it. I mean, the fact that we now know from John Bolton's book that was his big thing when he was talking to the head of China, that he wanted to guarantee that he was going to be reelected. It's kind of a weird obsession. Like I say, all presidents want it, but not to the point that they're going to foreign leaders and saying, I don't care what else you do, just make sure I get reelected. And I've always thought that he wanted to be reelected because he wanted to make sure that he didn't have to worry about being indicted, because according to a memo, 1973 memo from the Office of the Legal Counsel in the Justice Department, a sitting president can't be indicted. And as you know, the Supreme Court right now is considering the argument made by Trump's lawyers that a sitting president can't be investigated either. And most observers think the Supreme Court is going to say to him, come on, let's follow precedent here. Of course you can be investigated. And at one point in those discussions, actually, one of the judges actually said to one of Trump's lawyers, do you mean to tell me if he shot someone on Fifth Avenue, he couldn't be investigated? He actually used that example. And I'm sorry, she used that example. And the Trump's lawyer said, yes, that's what we mean. Well, really, anyway. So I've always thought he wanted to be reelected because he wanted to make sure he could be indicted. And at his age, he could spin it out another 4 years. And then, he's an old man and whatever. Now he's got to figure out what to do in the case that he's not reelected. And somebody pointed out intelligently today that he's got much more leverage now to cut a deal with the Southern District of New York or with a President Pence than he will as each day goes on, because if the idea is to get him out of office, it would be easier to say, if I go now, you got to promise that you're not going to indict me or any of my family. If he says that on January 19th, there's a lot less incentive to do that. So anyway, so that's the sort of larger pardon picture. But literally what would happen that's all the parting stuff. What would happen to Trump? And by the way, if he's not reelected, I actually don't expect him to stick around. I don't think he's going to hang around for Biden to be inaugurated. I think he's going to call it quits. I don't expect him to show up at Biden's inaugural parade. And that has happened before. I think Ken Eisner asked, have presidents skipped the inaugural events? And yes, John Adams skipped them because somebody had died in his family, and he hated Jefferson anyway. And Herbert Hoover's arm had to be seriously twisted to make him go. And if you look at pictures of him in the limousine with FDR, you can see he's like really unhappy about the whole thing. So anyway, I don't expect Trump to do that. But what would the RNC do? What would the Republican National Committee do if they lost their candidate? Well, first of all, there are members of delegates to the convention who are pledged to Trump. So they're pledged, and they are not automatically released to go to someone else. So whatever he suggests that they do with their votes, they might well do. But what happens is there is a rule in both parties for what happens if there is a problem with the presidential nominee or the vice presidential nominee. And just so you know, as I've talked about this before, the Republican and the Democratic parties are not part of our government. They are separate entities, and they can do whatever the heck they want to do. And they have these long, really arcane rules that they rewrite every 4 years at least. And I've read them, and it's weird because it's a very tight organization, but it's an organization you can join. So there's kind of like it's tight in some ways and really loose in others. Like you could declare yourself a Republican tomorrow and they can't say no, you're not. But by the same token, that doesn't necessarily mean you have rights. So it's kind of like it's not like being hired by someone. There's this porous nature, but then there's also rules inside. So the Republicans have a fairly complicated set of rules for how to replace a nominee, and it involves making sure that the representation of each state is somewhat similar to what it is in the convention itself. And there's I guess I'm not going to bother you with the details of that. There is a system in place, but what is a little bit more interesting now is the way the rules are written for the Republicans. They're written differently for the Democrats, but the way they're written for the Republicans is that the rule you care about is called Rule 9 if you want to go look at it. But Rule 9 in 2016 said that if a Republican candidate for either president or vice president left the race due to, and I quote, death, declination, or otherwise, unquote, after the convention, that the RNC went through all this to fill it. So that raises a question of what does otherwise mean? And this came up in 2016 after the convention in October, when the tape came out about Trump bragging about committing sexual assault. And a lot of Republicans were horrified and wanted to use otherwise to mean we get rid of you, And there's a big fight in the Republican Party about whether or not they can ditch the candidate after the fact. And I think generally the answer is no. But this really would be fought over deeply if it came to that. So if he withdraws, there's a system in place for what one would do. The Democrats also have their own system. And weirdly, I shouldn't say that, but it's much simpler than the Republican system. It basically is the same. The Democratic National Committee has the right to choose somebody new, but it's a much more streamlined system, which kind of surprises me out of the Democrats because their rules tend to be really fairly complicated. And in this case, there's a very simple procedure for replacing a nominee if something happens to that nominee. And by the way, that has happened. It happened in 1972 with Thomas Eagleton, who was a senator from Missouri who was on the ticket with George McGovern from South Dakota. PhD in history, by the way, Senator McGovern's great book. He is forced to withdraw after news comes out that he has received electroshock therapy for depression, and people operatives start to say that if he were in the office suffering from depression, it would be a danger to the nation. So he withdraws, and McGovern has to replace him, and he replaces him with Sergeant Shriver, who's actually a really interesting and a cool nominee. He is the guy who starts the Peace Corps and the Office of Economic Opportunity, among other things. So he's an interesting replacement. So this has happened in the past. One other little tidbit here is what would happen if somebody dies after the election, but before the electors are counted. And this has actually happened in the past. It's happened in 1872 when Horace Greeley died after the election, but before the electors were counted, and he had lost anyway. So it didn't really matter that he wasn't around for the actual technical election. What would happen if it happened in this day and age is almost certainly that the vice president would take over. But technically, I mean, I find this fascinating. Technically, we do not use our presidential electors the way they were intended. And I talked about that in the very first one of these that I did. And I think that would be fascinating if the presidential electors were in fact used as they were supposed to be, and the system was used as it was supposed to be, in which case, if the electors could not decide on a presidential candidate under those circumstances, the election would go to the House of Representatives, where each state gets one vote, which is the way it was supposed to work originally. I talked about that before. All right. So now I left one fun one for the end because you guys have suffered enough with all of my arcane history here. And I do, as I say, I actually prepared how to talk about campaign financing because I'm totally into that. I actually wrote a book on the first election where they used modern campaign financing. It was John Wanamaker who started the department store who invented modern campaign financing. But I'll tell you all about that. It's actually really interesting. I'll tell you about that maybe next week if you're interested. Anyway, Jacob Feather asked about Native American sports mascots. And I just have to answer this because I find this fascinating. He said, can you provide some historical context for the avalanche of schools and teams that adopted Native American mascots during the first half of the 20th century? The tapering off and slow and painful reversal of the mascotting, and why it's so hard for people now to accept and admit the racism embedded in the process of mascotting a living culture. He's a high school teacher, and his community is debating this right now. Okay, so I have a terrific student who is totally into sports history, and if anybody from ESPN is listening, you should totally hire her. Contact me. And again, I won't use her name because I don't want to bring people down on her without her permission, but I've always wondered the same thing. And yeah, I mean, I actually run a magazine where, we've written a lot about the mascots and how they got to be the mascots and why they were, how they were used that way and all the different characters that people say they're representing. And I still was like, I don't get this. Why did people suddenly start using these? I mean, why not talk about, I don't know, the strong man, or I don't know what it would be, but like, why American Indian mascots? And she finally explained it to me. And there's work done on this, not only hers, but other people have done this as well. Think about when this is, when these sports teams rise. So in the late 19th century, there's extraordinary concern that Americans are becoming wimpy. American men are becoming effete. They're working in offices. We've got the rise of white-collar work where men simply go to an office rather than working with their hands. Their hands get soft. And by the way, you can see this play out in Gone with the Wind. The idea that Ashley Wilkes is the attractive one and not Clark Gable. Who would pick Ashley Wilkes over Clark Gable? But this is in the 19th century, the late 19th and early 20th century, this sort of men aren't getting their hands dirty. And this is when you get the rise of a focus on on blood sports, if you will, on boxing, which transitions from being a lower class secret sport almost to a prize fighting sport. And that's got totally interesting stuff about race in it, of course, as well. But this is also when football becomes more acceptable. So football almost dies out in the late 19th century because people are literally dying on the football fields. And this is, Theodore Roosevelt actually steps in and tries to save football. And he tries to save football because he's all worried about Americans becoming too unmanly, becoming too feminized, and not getting dirty enough. And what he wants, think about Teddy Roosevelt and this moment when people are lionizing the cowboy, for example. They want people to get in touch, men. I'm sorry, this is all about men at this point. Although I'd love to talk about women's sports later. They want people men to get in touch with their masculine side, with their savage side, with their blood sports side. Teddy Roosevelt's going to be a boxer, right? And to be on the football pitch, if you will, and to be out there struggling with each other. This is when the Negro leagues in baseball, for example, really they're much more hard-hitting rules start to bleed over into the white leagues. And obviously we basically play a form of Negro League baseball now. But in order to emphasize that savagery, if you will, the adoption of those Western natural values into Eastern white society, they make their mascots these Indians, these American Indians, with the imagery that they are somehow savages. And they try and adopt that Western savagery, as they would say, into Eastern sports teams or into civilized sports teams to co-opt that animal nature in a very safe space. Your boy could get his degree in physics and go on to become an engineer or whatever. But by golly, he could be a football player and I don't want to use any of the terms, he could be a football player for the carjackers or whatever you would make the equivalent in the 19th century racist terms. And that made sense. Like that was their way of making sure that America retained its wild spirit while also being civilized into white collar and factory work. And so that's why there is, right in that transitional period, so many of those new names that come on. And then why they get preserved is in part because coming out of that same period, as I've written about, so in the last book, that's you also have this denigration of people of color, Black people, brown people, and the idea that it's kind of okay to have these racist symbols and that sort of duality of, what do you mean? We're actually honoring them. That becomes a tradition. Now, why people hang on to it in the present, even people who might in other ways be willing to be anti-racist, I think a lot of people really, and this is only my personal opinion, I don't study this stuff, I study the old stuff, but obviously I had children and have students in this era, and actually was on sports teams myself, all of which were simply named after the schools I went to. But there's a great example. I didn't row for Harvard, I rowed for Radcliffe. And I have my black jacket to prove it, not my red jacket. I think that those are formative years and people get really clingy to tradition. And the reason I say this is that there was a name change at my university for the school I was in, and a number of students came to me and said, "This is horrible, we don't want to be part of this name change." And I thought, who cares? Like, who cares what this name, you're going to say you graduated from the history department, not from this particular umbrella department in my school. And I finally said to them, we don't choose the eras we live in. The people who went to high school or were in school during 9/11 weren't able to say, we're going to roll that back, we're going to erase that. You simply have to live in the moment you're in. And I think that's really hard for people to identify, especially with a high school sports team, to recognize that it's okay that your dad might have played for some team and your name has changed. That's really okay. And that's a hard thing, I think, in a time when people are having trouble with transitions anyway, because they're growing up, because they're changing. It's like little kids, when they go room to room, they always carry one of their shoes with them. If you're a parent, you know that the kids' stupid shoes are never in the same room, and you think, why aren't their shoes ever in the same place? Well, it's because they carry things from one room to another to help the transition. And the same with their toys. And I kind of think about the names that way too. That doesn't mean they shouldn't be changed, but it does mean that maybe it's okay to recognize that people are feeling psychologically threatened when they have to give up something to which they have offered so much of their sweat and sometimes their blood. They can do it, but it maybe brings up more intense feelings than people are aware of when they simply divorce that name from the people fighting it. All right, so I think that's more than you cared to hear, but I'm actually kind of at loose ends today because I'm doing about 16 different things at once. So this is maybe more wide-ranging than you're used to. And I hope it was okay. There's more of my own personal opinion in this today than there normally is. Please discard it at will. It's just the way I'm thinking about this stuff, and I could just as easily be wrong as right. I do think about this stuff a lot, but and this is a great place to put my disclaimer, I'm a professor of American history, but I do not speak for my employer when I do these. And if this is interesting, I'll see you back here next Tuesday at 4 o'clock. And on Thursday at 1 o'clock, I will continue the history of the Republican Party. And I will quietly confess that I'm thinking of shoehorning in somewhere a discussion of the Declaration of Independence for Independence Day. Let me know if you think that would be interesting. And if not, I know we do this a lot. I will write something for Independence Day. Anyway, thanks for being here, and I will see you or not next week. Thanks a lot.